Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today I am joined by none other than our very own Gardner over here. Now if you've been watching the King's Cup so far, you will be very familiar with Bear. But for those who don't know, as I know there's probably some of you on YouTube who might not have been able to catch the streams or might not have been able to watch the full tournament sets, through yet, but Bear is a content creator for cards, does live streams, does YouTube. Links for all of that will be in the description. But Bear is here today to help me go over the decks for the King's Cup Grand Finals. Now, he and I both like to talk about decks quite a bit, and that's going to eat up into the stream time, especially because the Grand Finals is going to be a best of 9, so we have decided that we will go over the decks now, as well as prepare all of you for what decks to expect. Maybe you can test out some of these decks on your own, because the actual tournament itself will be on Sunday, October 20th at 11:30 Eastern. So that's good time. You're European, you're North American, pretty solid time right there. So come join me live on Twitch, and if you can't catch it live, of course the VOD will be uploaded here afterwards. And importantly for everybody watching, the Grand Final stream will also have a Grand Final giveaway. So there will be plenty of giveaways, both of 150 gold and 300 gold giveaways, which you can spend on anything you want. Alrighty, so the overview, the format for the finals is 5 decks, like all the previous weeks, but this time there is no bans. It is a best of 9. You have to win on all 5 decks that you bring. And of course, as throughout the entire tournament, no cards are allowed in multiple decks, so you can run as many copies as you want in one deck, but if a card shows up in one deck, you cannot run that same card in any other deck, regardless of rarity. And this final format is going to be standard. So all of the previous weeks have been wild, all cards in classic format, all cards that have ever been released in the game. This finals is standard, so this is going to be the closest that you see to decks that you see on ladder, and this is going to be the closest to decks that you yourself can play on ladder. And this is going to be the closest to the sort of the standard format of tournaments that we see elsewhere. And I thought this was the perfect format to end out the tournament on, because you've tested all of these wacky decks, and now here finally cards standard format, the format that is the game is primarily balanced around, to really test who is the best cards player out of the ones we have gathered here. So yeah, Bear, do you have anything to add to the format of the finals?
Yeah, just a couple of observations about how interesting this is as a format. Like, hugely important, I think, is to recognize the challenge that will come to some players with the non-existence of a ban. In most competitive formats, especially now in cards, we are used to seeing access to a ban. So if you see a deck that you really, really don't like, granted, recently that usually means it has Brit main, you can just ban it. But obviously that's not an option here, which is interesting. Obviously, best of 9 is a marathon, which is also a good reason why we're recording this, to save your sanity. And I think the key one here is that I love that J King saying this is as close as you're going to get to standard cards. Absolutely true, but because J King's J King and we like challenge around here, we still have that single overriding rule from the King's Cup, which is the fact that you can't rely on dupe cards, and that is a big thing. If you are in any way familiar with the meta in cards right now, and frankly for like the last 6 to 8 months, you'll be aware that there are a lot of staple cards, mainstays, that basically, if I'm going to see Germany, either as a main nation or an ally, I'm going to see 3 copies of Panzer 35T. I'm going to see 3 copies of 738 Jaeger Regiment. Only not necessarily, and I'm really interested because I'm kind of coming a little bit blind to see how people have done with the deck build on this, because I find that to be probably the coolest part of this, and I think it's going to make these decks have to be broader than we would normally see in, say, an OCC, where you can narrow into those staple cards. But I'm super excited to see how people build around it. But I do love the fact that you guys can take these decks and go play them on ladder and see how you get on with them. And I encourage you to do so, because it'll be fun. I intend to.
Yeah, exactly. And the approach that these two players took for sort of the format. We've seen a lot of different approaches throughout the different formats of this tournament, but our two players in the finals here took two slightly different approaches that we'll see once we get into the decks. And quickly here, just as a refresher, our two finalists are Innocent Bubbles and Baron Von Glower, both winning 2 of their 3 matches throughout the round robin stage, and most notably, Innocent Bubbles with a very, very dominant victory over Baron in the final week of the round robin. So that is a storyline in and of itself, and we'll save most of that for the stream here. But just a reminder: Innocent Bubbles, Baron Von Glower. Baron definitely needs to try to bounce back here. And let's get into the decks to see what Baron is bringing here to try to bounce back. And the first deck here we have is sort of just a very iconic deck for Baron, and a very iconic deck for just the type of things Baron likes to bring in general in cards, but also to this tournament. It is a Japan Soviet Shiden OTK with a self-credit denial engine to get there. And essentially the point of this deck is to just stall out your opponent as much as possible, and you're going to be doing that with guards, you're going to be doing that with pin, and while you're doing that, you're trying to draw through your entire deck, and while you're doing that, you are also going to be using some of these tempo cards like Desperate Measures and Commit the Reserves to reduce your own number of credit slots, and then that will enable, at the end of the day, the one roof that will give you the credits to play down Shiden, and then with Shiden you play Final Push, and you play a copy of Dawn Operations to reduce its operation cost to 0, and then you go face. And that's essentially how this deck works. And this deck seems a little memey at times, but this is a serious deck that I know people have played seriously on ladder, and if it hasn't been brought to any OCC at all, it has definitely been thought about being brought to OCCs as potentially one of the best ways to build a self-credit denial deck, particularly after the nerfs, because this unit, or this deck doesn't really revolve around some of the same cards that we saw eat nerfs after the nerfs to self-credit denial.
Yeah, I mean, this is an extra, like, to be clear, like, OTK decks are sometimes kind of janky, very difficult to actually get the OTK on. If you know what you're doing on this deck, and I have played into this list, I have played a variant of this list, I think many players at a certain level will have. The terrifying thing about this is that if you know what you're doing with it, this is actually incredibly consistent, because you have so many ridiculously good stall tools that will just let you chew through your deck. There are a couple of things that can go wrong. You can just get unlucky with draw. You can not find things until way too late, or you can end up on a fishing expedition where you literally are all set up with your self-credit denial and you've got your one roofs, and it's literally, can I in 90 seconds get far enough into my deck to find and play the combo tools before the timer runs out? I say that because I have played a variant on this deck where I got to exactly that point and 90 seconds wasn't long enough for me, which was really irritating because I had the combo in hand, but I couldn't play it out fast enough. But genuinely, Snowstorm is huge for delay here. Obviously, things like isolation can remove something and then bring it back. You've got island defense, which is there because Baron's not a fool and realizes the other thing that can happen to this deck is that you can go under it. But island defense is a really good answer to going under it because it's highly unlikely that you can go under it that fast. And then obviously you've got all the pin in the world with Underfire, which is horrible. And you've got Sally and Grand Plans as a draw engine, which is so efficient, and Lesser of Two Evils does exactly. Again, if you're not familiar, Sally is the bomber that you include never to really play because Sally says if this card is discarded, draw 2 cards. But the key is that it can be used with things like Lesser of Two Evils, so you can draw 2 cards, then the card that you discard draws you another card. It can be used, obviously, with Grand Plans, which is then gets a higher cost card. Notably, by the way, there are only 2 higher cost cards in this deck, both of which Baron really wants to see. That's not an accident either. And you can also use it with the guard that you deploy that says discard a card, gain attack equal to its credit cost, so you can gain 4 attack and draw cards. This thing is incredibly efficient. I do think a single copy of Imperial Strength was an interesting include. Single honourable death. We've got a couple of little tools in there, but for the most part, this thing is designed to go. I need to see my entire deck and gain a huge pile of credit slots within the first 6 turns of the game, and it's terrifying how efficiently it can do it.
Yeah, I really like especially calling out the Imperial Strength single copy because we've seen a lot of like single unit wombo combo OTKs in the past, and they were often just the reason they never were really that good is there was enough countermeasures in the game where you'd just hold up a decisive defense or you'd hold up from the deep and then your opponent would get all their credits and then they'd play down the big fury thing that was going to hit face for 30 and then it dies or it attacks and nothing happens. And just the single copy of Imperial Strength means that with all of these off Clorung going around in the meta right now, all these countermeasures going around, a Baron on the turn that he wants to combo just simply starts with an Imperial Strength, and then he is certain that there are no countermeasures up, and then he can just go in with the Sheedan. And I think it's just a very, very smart choice in this deck. I also love the single copy of Stand Together, almost certainly included to destroy his own 40th Cavalry regiments before they can be suppressed, as well as sometimes it's just like a good piece of removal. If you can trade out something with an infantry and then turn that infantry into a tank that can also attack, just a simple way of trying to get more units off the board. I just think this is a very, very well put together OTK deck. This is definitely something that's been worked on. It wasn't simply just let's build Sheedan OTK and put in the first cards that come to mind. There was a lot of thought and refinement that has gone into this list, and I'm very excited to see how this plays because, honestly, looking through this list, I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those. If you had a ban, you would consider it because the odds are that this list will get a win because mathematically, and I know I do go on about mathematics in deck building because that's the way I'm designed. Mathematically, this deck is so incredibly likely to see the combo, and as you say, has the one fix to the thing that can make you miserable about your combo that it's almost an unstoppable force in the sense that you know it's probably going to win once unless you get lucky against it 5 consecutive times. Highly unlikely. And I'm looking forward to seeing it pop off, if only because I personally love an engine this refined popping off, because I think it's a beautiful thing to watch someone who knows what they're doing playing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of wish we had slow mo for the pop off turn. I might have to see if I can get if it does pop off. I might have to see if I can get J King to send me the video clip so that we can slow mo it down at some point. Because the one thing I will say is if this thing does pop off on a fishing expedition, expect us or whoever's casting, anyone watching, to really struggle to keep up with the number of cards flashing across the screen. Because I guarantee you, Baron knows this deck backwards because you have to be consistent on it.
Exactly. And this is simply just one of the 5 decks Baron is bringing here. One of the 5 decks he needs to win with it, or win with. And honestly, I think this one is pretty rubber stamped to get a win if he plays this deck. But now let's move on to his deck number 2, and this is a deck that I know Bear absolutely loves. So Bear, why don't you take point talking about this one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. There are many people who know that I am a huge fan of Exile Air. I consider it to be very, very maligned in the sense that a lot of people, and I love that Baron's bringing it, because a lot of people look at Exile Air and they think because Hammer Home is the thing, that this is just a high roll deck and it's beating you. I did not hit top 50 on this deck or a variant of it with a 77-ish% win rate at the time because the deck is high roll. Um, this deck is very, very good at doing what it does, which is creating massive threats out of virtually nowhere. But it does do a couple of other things that I want to call out. So Obviously, the big engine here that people will immediately spot is the MS-406 into um, Hammerhome. Interestingly, for me, the optimal target for Hammerhome is actually Devil's Brigade, because Devil's Brigade is infantry, Devil's Brigade has big stats, and Devil's Brigade can both protect the front line and at operation like a 6-6 and a 7-7 Devil's Brigade at op cost 0 in the front line, followed by you then playing down your second Devil's Brigade with a threat of a fourth one coming out, is not a fun place to be. It's usually where a sensible human being hits the I surrender button. Uh, Hurricane is a hugely important card in this deck too, because it will come down and give the buff. Includes here that I think are very smart, that are variants that aren't normally seen on what I would consider the standard ladder list. ATS is not always seen because this deck doesn't normally need to draw cards, because game's usually over before you need to see much more of your deck. So usually you would just run Convoy. But I have a funny feeling that the inclusion of ATS might be because Baron might run Brit Ally or another Britain deck. We'll find out in a bit. ATS is a good fix to that restriction because this deck is not going to struggle to deal 3 damage to your opponent's HQ and get the draw. Evasive action and unexpected resistance are both amazing tournament choices because anything 0 cost countermeasure is, as I mentioned before, the ultimate tournament nemesis because it's free. You can't see it being held up. He's actually gone with 2 number 9 commandos, which I think is super smart for guard removal. And I'm not like a few of the other things like timely supplies. I assume that he's looking for ways to pull some draw. He's also got resourcefulness, which gives him the option of getting a hold of yet more number 9 commandos or other good fix units to give him strength. He's just refined the standard list, and of course he had to include the ultimate for me Baron von Glower Flourish to this deck, which is, hey, I've got a couple of slots. Why don't I throw MI5 in just to get a little bit of draw, but also make my opponent miserable? Which I think, again, if you're looking for alternate draw, you could have just run 3 copies of Timely Supplies. I think it speaks volumes to the way that Baron thinks that he decided that he'd rather pay the extra credit to have 2 copies of MI5. But yeah, I love this deck. Again, I think it's very strong. I think it's much more thoroughly thought out, and it is substantially more reliable than people think it is.
Yeah. Um, I really like that you highlighting the sort of the non-standard draw we see in this deck with the resourcefulness, the timely supply, the 2 MI5s, the ATS. These are all cards that, in my personal opinion, are on the weaker end of the card draw. The spectrum of good British card draw. Obviously, Britain has Convoy and how you build Exile normally and the Exile you see on ladder, and how I would recommend people build Exile is with just 4 Convoy instead of the MI5 and the timely supply. The resourcefulness is a very interesting one, because it's 1 credit draw, but it does narrow the cards you are finding, but
Mm.
it's still 1
Sincerely
credit
yours
draw.
also is, yeah, a
Yeah,
standard
sincerely
include
yours,
for a ladder. Yeah.
as well. And as we're about to see, that is because Baron, when given the instructions, the format for the finals, decided, you know what? I want to bring 2 British air decks. I want to bring 2 aggressive British decks, and they both can't have convoy, so you have to make some sacrifices. So he decides to take out the convoys from the Exile deck, which I think is the better of the 2 decks, as we'll see in a second, to take the convoys out of, because Exile oftentimes wins without it. The games where you're playing convoy is already dropping down in terms of like if you like look at your games based on the type of cards you play and how frequently you win the games. Once you get into playing convoy territory, you're dropping to the 50-50, below 50-50 games by that
Yeah.
point. Whereas his third deck that we're going to look at here is Brit USA Air. And this is slightly less bursty, slightly less aggressive than the Exile deck. And that's going to mean that it's going to want to stay in the game longer, and that's why these 4 convoys are coming into this deck. So Baron is taking a bit of a risk. and intentionally building Exile in what might not be necessarily card for card the optimal way, but it allows him to bring Exile and Air into this tournament, and that might not be something that his opponent Innocent Bubbles is really thinking about. You might be thinking, well, there's going to be one Air deck, and I can't ban it, so it's just going to get a win. Um, he's probably not expecting there to be two Air decks, so to say, and Britain USA Air. This card, there's not a lot of overlap other than the Convoy between this deck and the Exile deck. So he just has all of the Brit Air staples, the 1-cost, 1/3 Gladiator and Swordfish, Greyhounds to buff them up, Close Air supports to buff them up, Sea Embargoes to buff them up. And then on the top end, there is the 1 Raft Lightning, 1 Wellington, the Spitfire, Kitty Hawk, 1 Bomber Mafia. Obviously, since the nerfs to Bomber Mafia, there's been some question as to whether or not you include it, and if so, how many. He's decided to go with 1. And honestly, I think this is fine. He's building a bit more of an aggressive lineup, and with the amount of just sort of ramp control that's been going around on ladder, in a format that's going to be more closely represent ladder, I think leaning into the bit more aggressive decks here is probably the correct choice.
Yeah, I tend to agree. So Baron and I have had a number of conversations about what we like to call support line aggro decks. We both have a lot of respect for them in the current meta because I think they are actually very, very strong for the reasons that J King's just thrown out, which is that right now there is a lot going around that can answer good old fashioned grab the frontline aggro, but really will struggle. Now there are certain things that you can kind of pick out here that are different. I like the fact that Baron's chosen to keep 2 Paras C here. You do sometimes see 2 Paras C in Exile, because you can use it in combination with the 2 bomber options you have in an Exile list for the removal, but it has way more good targets here, hence using number 9 Commando in Exile. And I think the interesting thing, as J. King's pointed out, is you kind of have to look at these two lists together to understand the build of them, because they are normally two lists which, with J. King's restrictions, would be very hard to build. But Baron's done a tremendous job of just going at it. I love, by the way, the inclusion of a couple of 164th Infantry, which might look like an odd include, but the one thing you never want to be doing when you've got a support line aggro deck like this is having to deal with some annoyance in the front line that then helps that continued support line aggro, or worse yet, pops off onto a Greyhound, making it even harder to remove with its permanent buff. I think this deck is incredibly solid. I think this deck is very well thought out. I think personally, I probably would have actually pitched the Bomber Mafia and maybe thought about running a second Duress, but that's because I personally think Bomber Mafia is an optimistic include in this list, but I do understand why it's there. It's just so expensive to get it to pop that quite often you've won by then. But the flip side of it is it can be amazing if your opponent's got a really strong board state and you can get a hold of a little bit of suppression. I mean, it's a lot less suppression now because it doesn't take the whole board, but B24J is still useful. Illustrious is always good. Kitty Hawk, more of a workhorse than people realize. That deployment deal 2 damage can be absolutely key. Yeah, I love this list. Again, this is another list that I play a lot on ladder. I like my air decks. I started this game way back when on Brit US Air. But yeah, I think these two lists have shown exactly what figuring the card pool out is. And I think they are both going to be very difficult to stop.
Yeah, I think when given these restrictions and seeing that it's standard, which is limiting your card pool a fair amount, and it's within decks that you're probably going to have seen fairly often, or at least be aware of, like the Japan-Soviet OTK. I think there's 2 sort of approaches that you can go for here, and I think our players have taken the 2 approaches. As we'll see a bit later on, with Innocent Bubbles' decks, he went for a route of, well, I want as little I want as little interception between the 2 decks, or my 5 decks, as possible, just to avoid having to run slightly suboptimal versions of decks. So Bubbles basically went for as many different nation combinations as possible while sticking to pretty standard decks. Whereas Baron has leaned into the you know what, I'm going to bring multiple. I'm just going to bring like what I think are the best decks, and take some slight cuts to how powerful the deck normally is, but I still think that is going to be more powerful than another option. And with the way Baron has been building his deck so far, it does seem like he is trying to call out these somewhat slower, maybe a bit heavier control decks with an OTK deck, and then two very, very aggressive decks. And then all of what I've just said is supported by our look at Baron's fourth deck here, which is a third British deck, the British minor in this case, Soviet Britain, and it is Soviet Britain push OTK. So again, fitting into that combo of, or that theme of his lineup of trying to target some of these slower decks that might not be able to really end the game before Great Patriotic War and push can kill you regardless of health. And then in it, the British cards that he's running, cards that are completely don't have any issues with Exile or Brit US Air. It's the more control package of the British cards, and these are cards that you might have normally see in, say, a Brit US ramp or a US Brit ramp. Here, Baron is saying, you know what, I don't want ramp at all. I'm going to be using these cards for a push deck, and then the deck itself is somewhat standard. Obviously, there's always questions of what type of card draw do you include here. He's going for the 4 stiff upper lip, which I think is a bit more standard. Sometimes people like to sneak in 1 or 2 convoy on top of that, but obviously convoy's in Brit Air, so he's leaned into the enemy spotted, which is perfectly reasonable. The 1 copy of National Fire Service to ruin your opponent's day, and then the big Soviet board clears. And then, you know, just a ton of guards to work with the stiff upper lip and just slow your opponent down. The one notable missing card in this deck is we saw Soviet Ally being used with the Shiden OTK, the Japan main Shiden OTK, and in that we saw Snowstorm, which means that there is no Snowstorm in this deck, and Snowstorm is one of the most powerful enablers of push OTK. It's one of the most powerful stall tools. So just missing a single card does make a very, very big hit to this deck. So I think the big question with this deck is the loss of Snowstorm, is this deck still going to be able to get across the line with the loss of Snowstorm? And against Ramp, absolutely. Snowstorm's just one of those cards you throw to your hand to make hand space against Ramp. But this deck into Jagro or a slightly more aggressive like German-US or US-German deck could absolutely struggle with that lack of very crucial stall.
Yeah, I like the I. This is Baron on Moxie again. This is not a choice I would have made. Um, Literally because of one card. And I know people are going to be looking at us, I'm sure, as we're talking about decks in the way that we love to do. And it's like, these two guys are blathering on about one card. Is one card really that important in this deck? Thing is, it really kind of is. Now, I've been on record as saying that I personally am not a massive fan of push in the game and the way that it can affect and do things, but I've played plenty of it because it can be very, very efficient. But this deck, I like the fact that Baron's clearly recognised the absence and has made up for it, or at least tried to, with the use of things like enemy contact, which is getting him draw and pin. I'm sure if he'd had the space, he would have quite liked to have included naval superiority, for the same reason, because he can get some pin and some HQ defense. But I think he's decided, like, I'm not sure. I'm sure he thought about it and decided that he thought fortification was more valuable. I wonder whether we will, when we see this deck see play, see him wonder maybe whether he'd have liked that 2 naval superiority over the 2 fortification just for the pin to slow things down. But I mean, it still has everything that push needs. One particularly brave choice, if you've played this list at all or the variant on it, usually you run more than one aerial reconnaissance, because it is a very, very important tool for bringing the cost curve of your combo down, just in case you can't get it off the turn that you want to be able to. running one of says I know this deck well enough and I know OTK well enough that I will know the exact moment to use it, and I think that's I like to see that. I probably would have run at least two, but there you go. But yeah, I think Depths of Winter is probably going to be critical here because the timing of that uh, it will probably be Depths of Winter into Winter Warfare. To just board reset is probably going to be one of the ways of getting out of the hole that I thoroughly expect this deck to find itself in against aggro decks. It's just a statement of fact. It's not a criticism. I still think it's a very good deck, but I think this deck is going to, if Bubbles is running one or two really good aggro lists, this deck is going to have some very bad days because it's going to find itself in a hole and it's going to need a way out of it. And National Fire Service can only do so much.
I almost wonder if you would have been better served by going for a third British main deck and doing this Britain main push OTK, because obviously the big thing you lose is Great Patriotic War, and Great Patriotic War is a very, very important card for closing out anything that has healing, because the main issue with Brit main is you're kind of capped in at around 25 damage unless you make your deck really, really worse for one specific matchup, and on ladder and in tournaments where there's going to be Glamour Boys flying left, right, and center, that's a big issue, but in a 5-deck tournament where Glamour Boys can only be in one deck, that's really the only big healing card of the meta. So if you're only expecting one of your opponent's 5 decks to be able to heal out of your combo range, I wonder if it's better to just sacrifice losing the Great Patriotic War, make it Brit main, because if you think about the British cards that he would include into this deck, that aren't necessarily able to be fit in here, there's no overlap with any of his other two British decks. There's like the Wave After Wave, some more Glamour Boys. Pioneer Company
Oh,
wasn't used in any of
yeah.
his decks. The Naval
No, and
Powers, more National Fire Service. He cut
oh,
timely
name,
supplies from the one-up
yeah,
timely
the
supplies from
name,
Exile, and you include 4 of
oh,
those.
name missing me. Ridiculously buffed for no reason. Summon a massive guard.
Yep, yep. Yeah, it
The
just feels
countermeasure.
like first responders.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
it just feels like maybe that would have brought more to the table than sort of the Soviet elites, because you can then still run Bryansk and Sickles and Red Dawn and Push. Um, the sort of the core cards here, and you lose Depths of Winter, and you lose Great Patriotic War. Those are the big hits, but beyond
you
that,
do
you
get
can
carpet bombing that you can
yeah.
include, which is good. You, as you say, you get wave after wave, which is incredibly strong for board clear. I think if I'd have done it, that's probably the way I would have gone. I mean, I'm not calling. Baron knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
There's no call out here. There's no shade being cast. But I mean, were it me, I think you and I would both probably have gone Brit Main, just because I think, all right, fine. I eat the fact that if my opponent has a heal deck, I'm not going to win on this. But my opponent isn't going to run 5 heal decks, and I only need to win one match on this.
Yeah.
I mean, I do wonder if that would have been the better served option with it. I know it does tend to that you fill up your 12 cards very quickly if you're running the Brit main version of this. Your ally cards fill themselves up very rapidly. But at the same time, I think you have a few extra tools. You'd have been able to like max out the Glamour Boys, stuff like that.
I do
But
wonder if it is really just a specific call on what he thinks Bubbles is going to bring. Because if Bubbles
mm,
brings something like, say, a U.S. Britain ramp with 4 Glamour Boys, and then like a Soviet
yeah,
France or a Britain France with 3 Call to the Colonies, and then maybe an Italy, like Germany Italy with
yeah,
yeah, the Alpinis, and then
mm,
like if he brings that type of lineup, then the 4 decks we've seen from Baron so far would absolutely crush that type of lineup. And we've seen Bubbles earlier in this tournament bring a Japan France control deck. We've seen him bring some ramp decks, I believe, back in week 1. So it could be a specifically call out on what Bubbles is trying to bring, and a British deck that doesn't have Great Patriotic War would struggle greatly if Bubbles does bring a lineup that relies on healing in way more than what just one deck. Um,
mm.
so we could be seeing a bit of a call out here from Baron, and we'll get into Bubbles' decks to see how effective that is in just 1 second. But of course, Baron has one last deck for us to look at, and it is the German deck here. It is going to be Germany, Japan, just mid-range. And this is a deck that last season we saw a lot of this on ladder. We saw a lot of German US, a lot of German Japan. He's relying on the German-US side, and he gets to include those Jagro cards that he obviously didn't include in his Japan-Soviet because that was OTK. So he's going to be coming in here with the cavalries, the Type 93s, the Type 94s, and it's just a very, very aggressive, somewhat ground-based deck. We see the one copy of Blitzkrieg here, but there's also definitely an air sub-theme with 2 suppression, the Zustors, the Comets, of course the Eratos to fish them out. This is just a very, very efficient tempo deck. It's somewhere between US Frontline and Jagro in terms of how aggressive it is. It doesn't have quite the same staying power as Frontline, and it doesn't have quite the same just face race, burn your opponent down as Jagro. But it kind of falls into that sweet spot where you're not just going to lose to a single AoE. It's not like your opponent plays Winter Warfare and the game's over. And on the other hand, it's fast enough to have a much higher success rate in sort of these more anti-aggro ramp decks that sometimes just crush Frontline because they hit a bit of ramp while Frontline's doing not enough aggressiveness, and then they just start slamming down threat after threat after threat, and then Frontline just crumbles because they're just not able to sort of exploit their tempo enough to close out the game. And I think this is just really, really well positioned deck right there in the middle.
Yeah, I think one thing I do want to call out with this deck as well is this deck warms my heart because this deck is very CCG old school in the sense that this deck is not running a massive pile of. I mean, it's running Nakshu because why would you not? But it's not running a massive pile of external credit acceleration. It's not trying to leverage Reichsbank into Blitz Doctrine. It's not trying to keep the Panzer Grenadiers alive to pop. It's not desperately reaching for the one cost Alpine unit that gives you an extra credit. What it has is, if you look at it, it has a beautifully clean resource curve, which means that you are liable to see the cards that you can play, and it's heavy on the 2 and 3 drops. And the reason it's heavy on the 2 and 3 in the middle is that 2 and 3 tend to add up nicely to 4 or 5 or 6, which means that you can get good credit efficiency out of it. The other thing, this deck answers aggro decks so painfully it makes you want to cry and go home, because he has 2 out of the mist. No, aggro decks are going to tend to have a lot of 1 or very low defense cards. He has 2 out of the mists. He has 2 suppression. He's got the Arado to go fishing. He's got dive bombing for that one big threat, or just to pop a 1 damage unit that you can't get rid of any other way. He's got breakthrough, which gives him a huge tempo advantage on a swing turn because he can just pop something and then operate for 0. And of course, he's got let us not forget the fact that he has Comet, Zastora, and Shifting Attack. You will see Shifting Attack used on, in all likelihood, Panzer Grenadiers if he can get it. If he can pop Shifting Attack onto 20 Panzer Grenadier, that is obviously one of the big swings. However, Comet, Shifting Attack, Comet to the face again can be very annoying at late game if you can't pull guard. Like, I will say the one thing that I think this deck is weak into is anything that is guard heavy and has big defense. This deck does not uptrade the way that, say, Frontline does, but it gets the benefit, as you say, by having that harder aggression lean. I like this deck. I think this deck is the definition of what I would call a tempo heavy mid range deck. It is all about getting and maintaining it. This deck always wants to be the beatdown when it can be. This deck does not want to end up having to play control very much and has just a few tools to turn that round. But I think this is going to be very, very fun to see play. And I think what this deck has is not many bad matchups.
Yeah. And I think that's something you can kind of say about all of Baron's decks here. Obviously, there's the 2 OTK decks, and maybe your opponent has discard and hits a key combo piece. But again, that's one matchup. Everything else is just really, really solid. And, we saw Baron in this tournament absolutely dominate in week 1 and week 2. And then week 3, Maybe he didn't have the best decks, maybe he just got unlucky, but we definitely saw him fall in week three in just an absolutely dominant fashion by Innocent Bubbles. And I think Baron here is, week three he was almost guaranteed qualified to the finals by that point. Now that he's in the finals, there's a lot on the line. Of course, there's the prize pool, but 1939 is also going to supply a in-game watch board prop to the winner of this tournament as well. So there is a lot riding on winning here, and I think Baron is taking this not to say that he wasn't taking it seriously in week three, but I think he's taking it a bit more safe with the way he's built his lineup. I think he has put in more thought into what his opponent is going to do and how to build a full lineup rather than just simply bringing five fun decks that fit the format, five fun and good decks that fit the format. But I think he's taking this he's definitely put more thought, I think, into this than any of the previous weeks, and that's sort of what you hope. It's the grand finals. This is when to go all in on your lineup here, and I think Baron has done that for us here.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I mean, this is a hyper consistent lineup. This is a lineup where you have decks that you can look at and just tick and go, yeah, I'm pretty confident these are going to get a win. You've got a deck like this, which is, if this is the last deck that I'm playing to get my last win to win it, I'm generally speaking a fairly happy human.
Exactly.
Because it is just so consistent in hand. It would not surprise me at all if this was Baron's last pick as a deck to play in an ideal world, because it is the kind of deck that you can lean back on and go, all right, if I've got to rep this deck 3 times to win, my odds are pretty good that I'm going to be able to tack out a win.
Now, if we take a look over at Innocent Bubbles' list, we've seen Baron's decks, and we said all five, they look really, really solid. They look like decks that are going to get wins. Well, what does Innocent Bubbles have? And just starting off, first deck, already a deck that we did not see from Baron, but another very, very solid deck that is more than capable of getting wins. It is US-German Frontline. And obviously, we spoke earlier about sort of where US Frontline can falter. But there's also a lot of strengths to US Frontline, and that is its staying power in the game. It's not just simply going to lose to a late game board wipe like a Wave After Wave or a Carper Bomb or a Maelstrom. It's going to stick in there. It's not just going to lose because your opponent plays Guard and you needed to hit face with Comet 3 times to have any chance of winning. You're just going to instead play more Shermans, play more Panzer Grenadiers, play We Can Do It on a big board to get it outside of range of some of those damage-based AoEs, and then eventually set up a double Blitzkrieg lethal to get over the finish line, and that's not as just a sort of pray you draw it for a little bit of extra burn. That is a just slow, consistent control of the board until you play Blitzkrieg to kill your opponent from oftentimes 16 to 20 health. Frontline is not a burn deck. It is a mid-range deck in the most quintessential form that we've ever really seen in cards, and it just, look at the 1-drops it has here. 164th, Scout Car, Jaeger Regiment. These are absolutely nasty cards. They're going to absolutely destroy Jagro, but still be able to put on enough of a threat and get enough of value into a slower matchup. And then moving into the 3-drops, we see 2 M10s, 2 Half-Tracks, 2 Devil's Brigade, 2 Hellcats, and the Pathfinders. Really, Frontline is just spoiled for 3K options at this point. And then we see a little bit on the top end of Stars, and that's going to be quite good into the Exile and the Air deck, and then Strap Bombing and We Can Do It. Really, really solid deck. And this is a very, very good deck, but there is a reason Baron did not bring this deck, and that's because the 164th Baron had in the Air deck, the Devil's Brigade Baron had in the Exile deck, the Panzer Grenadiers Baron had in the German mid-range deck, as well as the Jaegers and the 35T. So this deck being here is really, really good in the lineup, but it does take away a lot of other options, or at least a lot of options that you, in the optimal way that you would like to build them. So we will get into what Bubbles has, whether he takes the risk and builds a bit more suboptimally, or whether he just brings different decks. But yeah, that's his frontline deck.
Yeah, I mean, this is the surprising thing about this to me, is that this is literally a flat ladder frontline deck with no compromises. There's no compromise here at all. This is you would quite routinely see this being played on ladder right now. almost in its entirety, actually. Stars and Stripes has become a much better include now than it has been for a while, because we're seeing a lot more of, again, support line aggro decks and air decks. Um, I love this deck. I can't ever say anything bad about Frontline because I don't think you can. I mean, it is in the same way that I said that Baron brought the kind of aggro leaning set to be the beatdown mid range deck. This is its polar opposite. It is still a tempo mid range deck, but it's an off tempo mid range deck. It's all about being able to handle the control side of things when you're taken off that side of things, when you're not the aggressor. Frontline has some of the best answers in the game. 99th onto a buff at the right time is incredible. PIR, if it decides to stop buffing itself for 5 minutes, is an incredibly useful tool. Or failing that, it becomes the thing that wins you the game because you're like 8 turns in and it's like a 47-3 infantry that won't stop buffing itself. But I mean, it is brave for me to include literally everything with no compromises here. One of the reasons I was surprised to see Frontline is how greedy Frontline is for the big staple cards. Because really, they're all in here.
Yeah, right now in the game, US is probably the most popular nation across main nation and ally, followed by probably Germany as a
Only.
close second. So using a US German deck that includes all of these cards, and then you also have Devil's Brigade, which is exile Britain, and all British decks like to run that as well. This is definitely using up a lot of slots. So let's get into looking at what Bubbles is bringing to try to make up for this deficit of sort of what we would think of like pretty solid conventional picks for other decks to fill out the lineup. And the first one here we have is Japan Soviet aggro. This is Jagro, but again, we saw the Jaegers and the 35Ts and the 22nds in the frontline deck. So Bubbles is saying, you know what, I don't need those with Japan. I'm not going into the full kill switch approach of doing the mono Japan, but if you look through here, there was only 6 Soviet cards. There was 2 copies of the 60th Cavalry to shut down decks that are playing lots of orders. There's 2 copies of Petliakov to shut down, particularly these German-US card, the sort of tempo cards are often the ones that use deployment effects, and then 2 copies of Respite, which is going to bring all of these Jagro units outside of just simple Winter Warfare range and create huge, massive threats. And of course, having a little bit of synergy with those 2 copies of Kagoshima to not heal the opponent 5, while still giving all of your units a buff. And then on the top end, I love these 2 Goshikins as just saying, you know what, this isn't your traditional Jagro. I don't have the 35Ts. It's not going to be quite as aggressive as I would want it to be. So instead of just making a subpar, a very aggressive Jagro deck, I'm going to embrace that and make it slightly slower, put a slightly more top end in on this deck. And you know what? I really like this. I think this is really solid. The Shibatas give you a good option to play on one that isn't necessarily going to lose you the game if it gets pinged. And it's just going to allow you to start to slowly build a board up into this game, and while still relying on expansions as very solid card draw.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the other thing that this deck is this deck is hell if you like to play control. If you are a big fan of playing control decks, this deck is teched very heavily to make you sad as an aggro deck. Because Soviets may not seem like the obvious choice. And when you do think about Soviets and throwing them into an aggro deck, in the past you've always thought about whether you can get some light infantry spam to get you some more zero op cost units that you can then buff up. What Bubbles has done here is he's concentrated on 6 cards which just put those key kind of either off tempo or control tools basically on lockdown and say, "Now, I just don't want to deal with you." You combo that with Shibata, which is doing its job right now in clearing out order heavy decks and giving them a thing that they need to answer. And this is in a really good position. I agree with you. I think that the 2 Goshi Kisen are an incredibly strong include because they are so difficult to deal with and such a pain in the backside because they basically are death to any guard unit that you put down. Immune to damage on your turn. It's horrible to deal with. The other thing that I really like seeing in this is running, because I know it's gone out of fashion a bit, is running 2 copies of Sendai Regiment. I know it has become much more traditional to kick those two slots and go, commit the reserves as doing it anyway, and that's permanent removal, or run some honorable death instead for again permanent removal. But Sendai Regiment can answer all sorts of incredibly frustrating things because even if you can kill the Sendai Regiment, remember the unit that comes back, particularly if you're dealing with, say, an air deck or an exile air deck, comes back with all of its buffs gone. All of that hard work disappears, and that can be devastating. I think this is, again, it's an incredibly solid list. And again, we see the Chiro, another fun thing to have in there if you just want to make certain people feeling that, like, I love my control decks and my orders. Again, it can just make you miserable. I like the includes. I think this deck is probably the smartest pull you could have made if you weren't going to just try and do the whole let's just go mono Japan aggro. I like this a lot. I think this deck has a lot to recommend it. This deck actually also low key. If you're watching this, you might find this deck does all right on ladder at the minute.
Yeah, I would
There are
imagine this
certain
deck is
decks
pretty
floating
good.
around on ladder that would hate to play into this deck.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think you sort of summed up that quite nicely. This deck is just very, very solid. And it, has the one drops to get to an aggressive start or to respond to an aggressive start, but then it has a bit of a late game. I think probably its worst matchup would be Baron's German Japan mid range, just because that is going to punish you for these somewhat slower turns like Kagashima or Chiro on 3, and as well as keep your boards as small for any early respite pop offs. However, I definitely think the early one drops can keep it in the game against Exile early, if you particularly with like Type 93s, and suddenly you're controlling the trades and the game's over. And then the Shibatas and these anti-healing cards can definitely keep it in the game into the OTK decks. So honestly, all around very, very solid deck. Coming out here from the Japan Soviet, and we've seen that's 4 different nations: US, German, Japan, Soviet. Let's take a look over at deck 3, and we have the 5th nation, Britain, coming in, and then we are bringing back the US. And here we can start to see where, so to some of the cuts are arriving. We saw Baron making cuts on Exile to build almost a perfect air deck. Now we see Bubbles making cuts on the air deck to build a perfect front line. So it's interesting what sort of where these players feel that they can make these cuts to build slightly suboptimal decks. But again, very solid air stuff. Swordfish, Gladiator, Cass, it's all there. But where the difference is there's no 164ths. He does have the Greyhounds, but no 164ths, and 2 supply priorities. So this is going to give the deck a bit more of a early aggro counter. We see no Bomber Mafia, so it's not late game value generation. The total value of this deck is somewhat down. There's not even a Wellington in this deck, actually. So it's a much slower or a much faster curve. Right into sort of right out of the gates. And then the other big cut that this deck has is there's no Devil's Brigade that you would love to just put into this deck. I mean, you'd love to put Devil's Brigade into every single deck that you can put it into. So we see a little bit of a very odd but interesting choice of the 2 mobilization. And I think this might be part of the reason why he doesn't run Wellington, is because if you look at the units in his deck, there's the Sexton at 5, and then the next unit is 2. So mobilization, where you're pretty confident it's going to pull a 1-drop, 2 1-drops, a 1-drop and a 2-drop, or 2 2-drops, you can play that on 6 and be pretty confident that you're not going to discard anything. And if that's true, it's just 2 credits, draw 2 units, and that's really, really good. So yeah, all around, very, very solid air deck. Not the traditional way you build the deck, though, at all.
No, it's definitely very adapted to the format. But like you say, I think very smartly adapted to the format. The lack of the top end is answered very heavily by, as you say, mobilization existing. There is definitely an undertone of wanting to have the ability to pop some threat on board, and I like that. Air Landing Brigade being included, always an interesting choice. It can be a bit controversial because there is an anti-synergy if you're buffing up your attack too heavily with the way that Air Landing Brigade is kind of giving you that extra damage. But I like it. I think Royal Research you're going to see played in a very specific way in this deck, because as I read this deck, for me, Royal Research is Royal Research into the second stage Royal Research into synthetic rubber, I think is very much the end game for this deck. It's kind of the only heavy end game this deck has, other than just pounding on you with Sexton until you find a way to remove it. But early on, this deck can really fly. Because obviously, for freedom, which you would quite often like to include in frontline, is here. We don't lose for freedom, so you get the card draw and the buff. Greyhound, again, the great advantage nowadays is you don't need Greyhound in frontline anymore because we have Scout Car, which means that if you're under this restriction, you can happily throw it in here and have it do the job that it arguably does better than it does in frontline. I think this is really good. My biggest concern with this deck is, can it find the finish like late in the game, or can it get traded out while your opponent is on like a handful of health left and just manages to get the front line and clear out your bombers, and you just can't find a way back onto the board. That'd be my only big concern with it. But ultimately, again, I think it's a very, very smart way of adapting a deck to a format that does make you think twice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this deck's biggest weakness is we see one Parasy and no number 9 commandos. So this deck's ability to get rid of big threats is going to be significantly reduced, and is going to have to rely much more on just simply getting these big bombers that your opponent can't respond and that's going to help you trade down these very high health units that control often gets out early. And actually, more thought on the supply priorities. It's not just like an anti-Jagro AoE card. The lesser picked option on supply priorities of repair all units is going to be pretty good at getting either keeping your bombers alive, in particular if your opponent tries to do any 2-turn setups with damaging it, and then setting it up into an AoE. But it's also going to help trade out the plethora of fighters that we have seen in the meta in the last couple of months, particularly with Zerstorer, where you can trade 2 5-health bombers, and it's not that difficult to get 5-health bombers in this game, into Zerstorer, and then you repair them off of 1 back to 5, and that is a huge, huge swing. So supply priorities for the AoE repair is actually probably going to be much, much more important than simply the AoE damage. And of course, you can always pick whichever is more important in that given situation. So supply priorities is actually a pretty interesting but pretty solid pickup here, I think, in this deck. And all around, very, very solid deck. I'm personally, just on paper, I would lean towards preferring Baron's build of Britain US Air. However, this is different enough that it's not just like, oh, there's a few card differences and this deck is just worse. There's cards that I have not tested in this deck, and we'll see both, do they perform well enough and how do they match up into each other? Because obviously, Baron doesn't have just a traditional Jagro deck. And we've seen Bubbles leaning a bit into sort of trying to counter that Jagro type decks, as well as Baron doesn't really have any just heavy control lists. Baron is sort of just in the middle with all of his stuff. So we will see if maybe Bubbles did not really expect the lineup that Baron has here. So now let's move on to deck number 4, and here is where we get to some very interesting places. Now, Germany, if you've been playing ladder recently, you've likely seen a lot of Germany, and it's all German-US or German-Japan. And with Bubbles bringing a Japan main deck and a US main deck, he decided that he didn't want to make any sacrifices with any German midrange deck, and instead bring in a different ally to Germany, and in this case, the Italian ally, and build German, Italy, Alpine. And this is a bold choice, because this is definitely not a deck that anybody likes in the meta right now. There's simply just too much removal, particularly the pack 40s that are seeing a lot of play now. Can just shut down Alpine with the amount of Reichsbanks in the meta. There's a lot of matchups where an early Reichsbank's not that great, or not that impactful. Alpine is not one of those matchups, because Alpine has very, very, very few tempo plays. Alpine just tries to play down really big guys. So if you can get an early game tempo play against Alpine and then control the units that they can play on the board in the following turns, it's just completely over for the deck. But Bubbles is sort of calling that out and saying, you know what? I don't think that those types of decks are going to be what I'm playing against. I think that Alpine can maybe find a spot, particularly against a lot of the slower decks from Baron. If we've seen just the decks Baron has brought throughout these tournaments, Alpine's a pretty solid pick into a lot of them, because a lot of them are just sort of pin things and stall things, and Alpine's perfectly fine with that, because they will just simply play larger and larger men until, like, you can't pin everything all of the time, and eventually they just have a 10 attack Alpine that's going to hit you for 10 and be impossible to remove. So I think this is a very, very smart decision against the type of decks Baron is expected to bring. I'm not sure how well it is going to work out into the decks Baron did end up bringing here today, because I'm not sure. I feel like Japan Soviet can reach its combo sooner than Alpine can end the game. Um, Push is probably this deck's best matchup. But the Depths of the Winter, the one of Depths of Winter in there, just means he can at any point fully reset the board. So as long as that Depths isn't at the bottom of his deck, this deck seems like it's going to be very difficult to get a win with from Bubbles. This is the deck I'm most worried about. However, it has Geburg's Pioneer, and it's Alpine with Sudden Strikes, so of course it could always just go first against Air, and then the Air plays the Swordfish, and then he Sudden Strikes and plays a second Geburg's Pioneer, and then the Air does something else, and then you did like Dornier, and then push up a 3-4 with the Dornier, and your Geburg's Pioneers are covered, and the game is just completely over by turn 3. Alpine is capable of winning against anything if they just have a slightly suboptimal start to you having a great start. So yeah, do you get the same feel about this deck being the weakest one we've seen from Bubbles so far into Baron's lineup?
Yeah, I'm not. I have no disagreement. I have endlessly, because I actually think almost all of us who play to any particular level will say that at some point every season we roll out Alpine, dust it off, and see if it's finally found its way to do the thing that it really desperately wants to do. And honestly, actually, I think Dornier is as close as I've seen to Alpine getting the tool that it so desperately needs to get past its biggest problem. But I don't think it's enough. And my concerns here are very much the same as yours. I think, in the same way that I mentioned, like, Baron's German deck basically has no bad matchups, this deck doesn't have that many great matchups. It has a couple of matchups where if it can get going, it can do okay, but it's also got some. It has the potential to end up very compressed in the. So the other thing you don't want in this is you do not want to end up compressed to your support line playing an Alpine deck like this, because there is no way out. Everything is far too slow, and you end up with a handful of cards that would actually be really good right now if you could just get them on the board, but you can't, and then your big guys work against you because they're trading very efficiently, but they just won't die to give you. And this is actually my own experience playing Alpine. There are a couple of includes here that I think can help. I like Through the Breach. I like including 2 Encirclement, because that is an attempt to say, look, I know I'm going to need the front line next turn, and I want a way to guarantee it so that I can actually get there without having to cheat through Dornier. I'm not so sure. Like, I am concerned for this. I think this is definitely going to be the hardest deck for Bubbles to find a win on. At least of the ones we've seen so far. I do think including a couple of 7 Schutzen is really smart, because while they aren't Alpine and they don't synergize, one thing that you may have experienced if you have played Alpine is that moment where you get off to a really good start and you knock your opponent down to not a lot of HQ defense, but then they find a B-24J or some suppression, and suddenly the front line's gone, and you spend the rest of the game going, I don't have enough reach, I can't find my comet. Schutzen can be the answer to that with the ping damage from the promotion. That's a smart include. Heinkel's good for obviously finding stuff, but yeah, I'm not sure that there are certain decks here like I will say from personal experience that Air Exile absolutely loves this matchup because while you're busy getting your feet set, we've eaten 90% of your HQ defense, and then we're just waiting to draw Sea Patrol for the rest of the game to kill you. Um,
Well,
but
that bringing up HQ defense, it brings me to two copy of Vanguard in this deck. And Vanguard, for those who don't know, gives an Alpine unit Blitz, and when this unit, or damage this unit does, gives your HQ equal health. I
defense,
forget
yeah.
exactly how it's worded, but essentially
Yeah.
it's like Old Mary Nostrum, specifically for an Alpine unit. And that, if you spend the first few turns just getting up to like a 7 attack Alpine unit, and then you push it up, you encircle it to get an 8 attack Alpine unit that can attack already, and then you Vanguard that, and then suddenly you heal 8. And against an aggro deck, they've now just lost the game because you've healed 8, you're going to heal probably at least 16 more, and you have a 7-6 and an 8-7 in the front line. And, the game just over. However, that does cost a lot of credits. And is he going to reach that point of the credits? I'm unsure. There's also two copies of Kermark in this deck, which we saw Bubbles bring earlier with, I believe it was a Britain-German air deck with countermeasures and Kermarks to trigger them. And obviously that deck took a win. This deck has no countermeasures. Kermark is just a 3-cost 3/3 Alpine. So two copies of that is odd to me when he's not running max copies of the 3-cost 4/3 Alpine or the 3-cost 2/3 Alpine that grows. I think maybe he put that in here and had a countermeasure package and then took out the countermeasures and forgot to take this out, or maybe he used to have off Clorungs in the deck to develop countermeasures. Or maybe I'm not exactly sure, but the Kermark sort of makes a bad deck worse here in this situation where it is the way his deck is built with in an open deck list tournament. It is just strictly worse than a fourth copy of 136 Geburgs Pioneer or
Yeah.
Geburgs Jaeger, sorry. So yeah, it's maybe this was the fifth deck here. Maybe this is sort of went through multiple iterations and this is a leftover. But yeah, sort of in a format where you have to win with all 5 decks, this is certainly the one that I do not want in my lineup once I see how refined Baron's decks are. Baron did not really bring any deck where it's like, oh, okay, well, I brought maybe one weaker deck, but like I'm going to get a free win against that. This is sort of the deck that Bubbles, do you bring it early and just try to ram it into as many things as possible until you get an early win? Do you try to win with everything else and then keep this in your back pocket? We're gonna have to see, but it's Alpine. Again, it has it has Geburg's Pioneers. This is capable of absolutely rolling Baron. The Vanguards could get really tricky, particularly against the Japan Soviet because that doesn't have Geburg's Pioneer, and it doesn't have it doesn't have Great Patriotic War for the health reset, and it could potentially be slower than the sort of the push deck, depending on how the draw goes. So maybe just a Vanguard to get enough healing. A Vanguard for 16 is probably going to be enough for that Japan Soviet deck to not be able to finish the game. So yeah, it's definitely going to be able to win. We're not just simply going to watch the Baron show. But yeah, the Bubbles maybe not bringing the best deck here. But this is only the 4th deck of a 5-deck lineup. And let's take a look at his 5th deck. And this is a deck I really like. This is a deck that I think is going to get a win. This is a very solid deck. It is Soviet Japan self-damage. The only Japanese cards in this deck are 2 copies of 33rd Recon, 2 copies of Scouting. Why am I blanking on the name of the card? Scouting.
Routing Party, yeah.
Party. That's the second word there. And this is sort of a very traditional build of self-damage in terms of the Japanese slots. Up until Island Defense, and then people sometimes run 1 or 2 Island Defense. But for a long time, self-damage was just a 4 Japanese cards deck with those cards. And the reason he doesn't run Scouting Party is something I'm very excited to talk about, because this is very innovative in a way that I think is very powerful potentially, and potentially could change the way people build self-damage moving forward. And that is the inclusion of just this massive tank, sort of these massive relying on the tanks with the counteroffensive, just being a little bit faster, so it's not relying as heavily on the infantry, and just like really making your deck capable of ending the opponent with counteroffensive at any point. Um, and even if not that, just being able to put tank damage, even if they're not buffed up, just hit face for 3 with a T80, hit face for 5 with an SU, and then of course the SU 100 is always going to be able to hit face for 8, if not more. And yeah, it's just doing the regular self damage stuff, but rather than some of these slightly slower cards, you are relying on somewhat more aggressive build of the deck with just sort of the types of units you play. And I think that this is very solid. There's actually no healing in this deck whatsoever. There's not engineers. There's no road to Berlin. This deck is just saying, I'm going to kill you before you can end the game. And with the way Baron has built his decks, obviously push is going to be able to sometimes, if you're just low enough, single red dawn push face for 9, or 6 is just going to be enough. Um, However, the Sheet and OTK deck sort of kills you where it doesn't. It's not a deck that's capable of putting out like 8 damage particularly easily. So this deck, I think, is going to be really solid. We see Baron doesn't have a Jagro deck with lots of burn. So, I think the decision to not build a ton of health and rather bring it healing and just say, I have 20 health, it's going to get reduced, but I'm going to play down tanks and kill you, I think is going to work out pretty well.
Yeah, I think this is a very, I'm very excited to actually go off and play some matches with this lineup, because this is a very different to what we are currently seeing version of self-damage. We've seen a lot more of the kind of slow and steady stuff, as you say, where self-damage is coming back, but in a much more kind of plodding trading way. This is I've talked about it when we've been casting before. This is very Vindaloo soccer. This is very I'm going to beat you, or I'm gonna lose. There isn't a middle ground here. Like you're not running a bunch of guards. You're not running a bunch of like heavy defensive. I want to take this out. You're not even running HQ defense from your the engineers. You're not running any way of healing from your units being destroyed. What you're saying is, I've got enough tools here to keep knocking you off the board, and start throwing these tanks at you. And like the T-35s and the T-80s will become an absolute menace. SU-76 does its own thing, obviously. One of SU-100, I think, is a very smart move. SU-100 can be really good, but I don't know whether it's good enough to justify 2 slots in a lot of lists, because it is very situational, whereas a lot of the other tanks are not. And obviously, the KV-1 1941 can be something that drops on board, and you literally just look at and go, well, unless I can find X card, that's just game. And guess what? I don't want to play draw to get to the card that I really need to answer it, because it's going to kill me. I love this list. I'm really quite excited to see it see play. I do think this will get a win. I don't think Baron has enough decks that are going to just, like, as you say, push is going to probably at some point you're going to play this into push, and then push is going to go, I'm just going to have a really heavy winter sneeze and you're dead. But many of Baron's other lists do not have strong answers to this, because this thing can go quite fast for a self-damage list. I like it a lot. I think it's a smart move.
The With this build of self damage, he has 11 tanks with the ability to create a 12th tank with the stand together. I almost wonder if this is the direction self damage goes in. At what point do you start putting in some like very small tank synergy cards? Like you could run the SU-85 on the tank that heals 3 every time a Soviet tank attacks. Just one of those. That's your healing. You run healing in the form of a
Yeah.
unit, or the SU-152 that gives them extra attack and heavy armor to just be slightly stickier on board. Like we're reaching the critical mass of Soviet tanks that maybe the Soviet tank deck we've all been dreaming of for years and years and years is actually a self-damage within like a self-damage deck. Maybe that's the direction we go in. But either way, I think it was correct for Bubbles to not be that adventurous with what he brought to this tournament. This deck is very solid. The frontline deck solid. The air deck a little experimental, but largely solid. Um, And then, of course, there is that Alpine deck that is going to raise some questions. And the Soviet deck is also quite experimental, but I think very solid. So I think all around, four very, very solid decks, and maybe one that's a bit on the weaker side. But yeah, that is Bubbles' 5 decks. That's going to be going up against Baron's 5 decks. Um, Now I have to ask you, Bear, who do you think is going to win and at what score? Because we are going to see at minimum 5 games between these players. But do you think we're going to be getting, 7, 8? Are we going to get the game 9? What do you think is going to be the outcome here?
So, oh, you had to do it because you're evil. No, it's fair, and it is a thing. But it's all right. I'm going to turn the question back on you in a minute. I would say for me, I think Baron will take this. I think Baron will take this based on the consistency of his lists. I think the thing about Baron's lists is that they are definitely all good for a win, and there are a couple of awkward matchups in here. But I think they are. I think Baron has, as I say, that fifth deck in that German deck that you can be like, all right, I've got my 4 wins, and whatever else is true, unless we go to a game 9, I can sit back and believe in this deck. And I think his decks are positioned in such a way that I think he will probably do that, and that wouldn't surprise me. For that reason, I think we will probably see 7 or 8 games. I'm not convinced we'll see 9. So my guess is that Baron will take this, but I think he'll take it. I believe in Bubbles enough that I think Baron will probably take this 5-3, would be my guess based on the lineups that we've seen today. But now I get to do the fun part where I flip the thing on it and go, all right, so, you've been doing this a long time. What do you think?
Well, I was going to actually say 5-3 myself. Um, Now so I'm going to pick something different though. So between 5-2 and 5-4, because I do think it's going to be 5-3. But if I had to guess between 5-2 and 5-4, I think I would actually lean slightly closer to saying 5-4. I struggle to see a world where Bubbles does not get at least 3 wins. He has some very, very solid some very, very solid standard decks in his lineup that he absolutely knows how to play. He absolutely knows how to pilot them. And Baron's decks in this tournament, they're a little like, if you're someone new to the game, you might not be used to, say, the Japan Soviet OTK. But I know Bubbles has played enough cards. I know he's played against Baron enough times that he's used to his shenanigans. I don't think Baron's going to be catching Bubbles by surprise with anything he's brought here. So you know what? I think it's going to go down to game 9. I can see that happening in one of 2 ways. I can see either Bubbles leaves the Alpine deck for last, wins with everything else. They one both have won 4, and then it's game 9. Alpine deck gets brought out for the first time and simply can't get across the line. Or Bubble says, you know what, I need to win with this deck, so I'm just going to bring it first, and then loses 2 or 3 times on the Alpine deck, and eventually gets a win on it, but he's just far enough down in the total set together that just trading back wins with his solid decks, it does eventually lead to Baron edging him out slightly just by the finals. But that's both of us saying that we think Baron's going to win. However, have either of us ever been right in our predictions so far? Maybe once or twice, but this tournament has shown us some truly wild outcomes. I mean, Bubbles absolutely stomped Baron in their last meeting, and we thought that was going to be a very tight game. And Bubbles said, you know what? No,
Nah.
I'm just in the zone. I'm feeling it. You might not like my decks, but I like my decks. And I'm gonna just pilot them really, really well. And get across the finish line. So,
No, no, I am 100% prepared to round up Sunday going, yeah, I was wrong. I stand by like logically I stand by the prediction I have based on what we see, but pilot skill has been a huge part of this. But also, it's as you say, I think there's the psychological element has also been huge, and I think we saw that in play quite heavily in the match between Bubbles and Baron. And you can go see my interview with Baron, and if I'm very lucky, I might be able to get one in with Bubbles before we get to Sunday. But I think that this tournament has been very happy to make both of us go, wait, what? I didn't see that at all. Like, I would not be at all surprised. Genuinely wouldn't. For us to like the tournament opens up on Sunday. The first thing we see is Bubbles rolls out the Alpine deck and is like, "Win," and I'm just like, "All right then,
Yeah, if Bubbles brings
sure."
Alpine in game one and gets a win, all of our predictions are out the window.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean at that point, I'm straight up on. I have no idea what's going to happen because
yeah,
yeah, I mean, that's part of what's been great is seeing that innovation and that change and those little tiny weaknesses slash adaptations in deck lists are going to be so pivotal. I think, and I'm very, very excited to see it. And genuinely, breaking decks down like this is so much fun when there's so much to break down, and you're not just like, oh, it's US ramp, US ramp, uh, vamp. Can we do the next deck? Because
yeah,
and there is a bit of that does come around sometimes in OCCs and stuff where you're like, how many times can I say something interesting about the same deck? But that's not been the case yet. What is really interesting to me is we've seen 10 very different decks. Like the closest we've got to like pure kind of synergistic, oh, they both went in the same direction, is they did both bring Brit Air, but even then, they didn't bring the same Brit Air. Not even close.
yeah. Oftentimes, in an OCC top eight, there's 24 decks. Oftentimes, it's like 6 or 7 total different decks in any meaningful differences. Here we have 10 decks. Of those 10 decks, we have 9 unique archetypes and nation combinations, and in those 2 decks, they're both Brit USA. They've built in such a meaningfully different way that they're going to play out differently. They're going to pilot differently, and yeah, it also shows the differences in the players and what they're trying to do with their lineup, and also just how they like to play. So I'm very excited about this. Let's start wrapping this up. So, guys, thank you very much for watching. If you've got this far, remember Sunday, October 20th. That is this upcoming Sunday. OCC on Saturday. Kings Cup Finals on Sunday. Be there live if you want to cheer on your favorite player and get a chance to win some of the giveaways. And if you can't make it live, no worries. VOD will be up later. Let me know who you think is going to win and what you think the score is going to be in the comments down below, or join my Discord to continue the conversation there. And of course, check out Bear Gardner, his entire channel, but also his interview with Baron von Glower talking about the King's Cup tournament over on his YouTube channel. The links will be in the description. And guys, thank you very much for watching, and we will catch you on Sunday for the King's Cup Grand Finals.